Hello, everyone, and welcome to this 38th Urban AI conversation, for which I have the great pleasure of welcoming Manon Revel. Hi, Manon.
Hi, Hubert. Thanks for having me.
Great pleasure, really, of having you for this conversation, Urban AI conversation, which is dedicated to collective agency and also democracy and AI. Well, many fascinating topics we will explore using your actually research as leitmotif. A few words about Urban AI just before Urban AI. It's a global organization dedicated to the emerging field of urban artificial intelligence. We federate a think tank, a community, and also an academy. And we regularly organize Urban AI conversations with international entrepreneurs, researchers, public servants to explore and discuss some of the latest research experiments or topics. And so for the 38th Urban AI conversation, I have the great pleasure of welcoming Manon. Manon, maybe first question, easy question actually. Could you introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name is Manon Revel. I'm an AI researcher. My background is in applied math. I've been really interested in thinking about how we can model human and AI collective decision making in lots of different contexts. And most of my work have been around modeling and thinking about this networked world in an AI age.
May I ask where and how you get this kind of interest or even passion, which is not that much common, and the intersection of mathematical modelization and democracy?
I guess it's kind of easy in that I had lots of interest for the world and how we organize ourselves growing up, almost from a humanities perspective, and I loved math, and so my academic kind of path kept me doing more and more math. At every time I was thinking whether I should start doing more humanities or keep on the math track, and I kept on the math track. But then there was a point where I was eager to try to incorporate some of my passions and just real world interest, and also started to realize that math is a beautiful discipline, and there's so many interesting theoretical wonders that one can study, but it's also a real tool to understand better some systems. And kind of exactly in the same fashion, I got really interested in graph and network science, and graph theory is really beautiful, I find, part of mathematics. And it's also such a great abstraction to represent, human networks or social networks or just any kind of collective interactions. And so I started to think more and more about how we can close the gap and use some of these tools to represent the world we live in.
About your background and maybe in a sense where also you learned some of your math. So you did engineering studies at Centrale Supélec first?
That's right.
Which is like French engineering university. And then you did your PhD. Where was it?
At MIT.
Okay, MIT. And can you share the topic of your PhD?
Yeah, so I worked on this math models for collective decision making, and one of the thing I studied the most during my thesis was this system. It's kind of a multi-agent decision making system that people call liquid democracy. And I stumbled upon it right into that moment where I was super interested. COVID was started, and I was super interested about how we collectively organize and how we sample expertise and how we kind of manage this high intensity distributed world. And I was taking a class with a mathematician at MIT called Elhanan Mosel, who's a social choice theorist and probability theorist, and mentioned to me this idea of liquid democracy, which is a very simple idea where, if we think of it in the context of voting, at the time of making a decision, people have the choice between voting themselves or delegating to someone they trust. So you just add a small tweak to what we already know, which is either I cast a ballot or I nominate someone who will cast a ballot on my behalf. And I like to think about it about not only tapping into our first order knowledge, which is what I know about a topic of interest, but also second order knowledge, which is what I know about what you know. There are many things in the world that I feel are really important, but I don't have much knowledge about. But I know many people around me who have knowledge about these topics, and I would greatly refer to them if I had a question or if I wanted, someone to tell me what to, or help me just make an opinion. And in fact, it's something we do very naturally. We call people, we ask people, we read books. I mean, this idea of sampling second order knowledge and using what other people around us know is something that we do quite naturally. And the idea was to study how would this change the mathematical theories we have about vote aggregations if we were to allow to use not only first order knowledge, but also second order knowledge. And for a quick deep dive into the math theories I'm talking about, there is this pretty old paradigm from 1785 that a French mathematician and philosopher, Nicolas Condorcet, introduced. It's the idea of the epistemic model for voting. So and I call it it's an aggregative view. The idea is that you have a bunch of people and they are each represented by a random variable. So everyone is kind of a coin toss, and the coin toss represents their probability of finding the correct answer. Let's say, like, I don't follow soccer much, but I guess you're in France. Let's say that we have to make a prediction about whether or not PSG will win the next game. Each of us have some probability of knowing this. And so Condorcet had this very simple framework saying everyone has some probability of knowing the ground truth, of making the right prediction, and this probability is different. Mine is probably pretty low because I don't follow and I'm not a huge soccer fan. But what he proved is that as long as the average person is no worse than a random coin, the probability that the group is correct, if instead of just taking one person's vote, you aggregate by looking at the majority vote, this probability will go to 1 exponentially fast as the group size increases. And that's the idea behind collective intelligence, was the idea that you can have a bunch of independent, imperfect signals, but you'll have a really good outcome if you group the signal together and you just go with what the majority votes tells you. A very important assumption in this framework from the 18th century is that votes are independent. Now, in practice, when we have a networked world, the votes are not independent because we talk to one another. And it's for the longest time, and it's true mathematically in many cases, correlation was thought to harm the power of collective intelligence, because at least the probability that you're correct collectively doesn't go as fast to 1 as it would with independent votes. But also in some contexts, if you have too much correlation, it will harm this actual probability. So you have a kind of a clear trade-off, because if you correlate with the experts, you increase the average expertise of your group, but you lose the power of independence and aggregation. And basically, my thesis was in a big chunk about studying this interaction and studying the regimes where using something like liquid democracy and delegation would not harm the group outcomes versus scenarios where it would harm the group outcomes. So it was kind of doing what Condorcet did. He did this in the context of independent majority voting, and I did it in the context of a network society with people trusting one another.
Which, if I understand well, in a sense, make it more complicated because you have kind of more variables, or like, as you said, those individuals, they are not independent, so they might exchange information, creating frictions.
You mean is the math analysis more complicated, or the...
Exactly, in your case, like doing it in kind of real world conditions?
It definitely taps into other kinds of tools, in that for those of your audience who've encountered some of this kind of probability theories, the Condorcet framework, the Condorcet results is a direct consequence of the law of large number, which is this idea that if you have a bunch of samples that comes from a distribution, if you aggregate these samples, they will likely concentrate around the mean of the sample. We don't need to go maybe into much details, but there's a small, maybe I'll just say in passing, nice, maybe, I don't know, historical thing here, which was that these results preceded the Condorcet result from a tiny, I think, just a few maybe years or decades. But Condorcet did not use this theory to prove his theorem. He used something different. But yeah, so what we were studying incorporates elements of random graph theory. And maybe I can also say quickly one thing about this, which is that studying correlation structures can get quite messy it's even really hard to define what is a correlation structure. What kind of correlation do we suffer from in society? It's not even easy to describe. But it's much easier to capture correlation structures if you define them at the level of the graph. So if you're saying that, let's say we have three people, I can define how the votes correlate, or I can say, well, Manon trusts Uber, and then my graph is just a link from me to you, and then the third person who just vote themselves. This induces a correlation structure. But now instead of talking about correlation, I can talk about the graph structure. And it turns out that it's easier to reason about this problem when you think about the graph structure and not about the correlation. But then to your question, the piece that you add compared to the Condorcet framework is the study of these graphs. And you can think of it as we are all connected. We have an underlying social network. And then if you use something like liquid democracy, you have flows that are activated on your graph. Like I delegate to you. Now we are in the same component. Someone else delegate to you. In fact, the three of us are in the same component. And so a lot of my work during my thesis was studying the dynamics of the creation of these graphs and then map it back into the probability that collective intelligence works.
Does it mean that Condorcet invented, in a sense, collective intelligence, or would it be too bold saying that?
It would be too bold saying that. I mean, the idea of collective intelligence or wisdom of crowds is something you find at least back to Aristotle, maybe in other contexts. I think it's fair to say that he's the first person who provided a quantified formalization of collective intelligence and wisdom of crowds. I think that would be fair to say. I don't know exactly. I don't know. There was no Google word search at the time, so I don't know. We can't trace back how often the word collective intelligence has been used and whether his theorem was really like the beginning of something. But he's definitely a big figure in that field, and it's interesting because it's you had his work that came first, and then you had statistician who started collecting data to check his theorem. So that took about 100 years, but the most famous experiments were done by Francis Galton, who has a famous experiment where he asked people in a fair to weigh or to estimate the weight of an ox, and found out that the average of all of the estimates was closer to reality than any single estimate of any single human. And that's been kind of the continuation of things, of people being interested in the kind of collective intelligence, wisdom of crowd thinking. But definitely, people thought about it and realized this was a thing before Condorcet. But he was the first to quantify it.
How do we explain this phenomenon? The fact that like collective intelligence, or like many people will be able to find an answer to a topic on which they have individually no expertise?
It's back to this idea of law of large number. So if you have a bunch of people who have noisy signals of the truth, that's kind of the core assumption. Core assumption is that you can think of it as the truth is like some number, and my probability of telling you the right number is noisy. So it's not too far from the truth, but the variance is wide. And so the number I actually give you is something not too far from the truth, because the idea is that my distribution is centered around the truth. But if my variance is wide, if I have high uncertainty, it's very likely that I don't tell you the truth, but I tell you the truth minus 10 kilograms. But if everyone it can be represented by this kind of uncertainty model. When you take the average, you can think of it as you kind of wash out the uncertainty. This is true only under certain assumptions, like people's estimate being biased towards, not being biased against the ground truth, but being centered at the ground truth. But that's this law of large number. When you have many people and you put them together, if they are not actively biased against the truth, good things happen.
So does it mean, it's a very theoretical question, but does it mean that democracy is on the paper, mathematically, the best way of governing a political body?
I've always been quite careful in taking math results and throwing them into the real world, and it's why I keep talking about things like predictions or estimating things for which we know what is the outcome, and I talk about ground truth for something we actually know, what is what, because I think this is where the math frameworks work well. If it's you work on prediction, like prediction markets, I think is a great place to think about this, or yeah, like, the weight of an ox, there is a ground truth, like that the ox actually weighs something. Democracy is much more complex. In many cases, the whole point of doing democracy is to discovering collectively what we want to do. And oftentimes there is no ground truth for what it is that we have to do, what we want to do. And I think democracy is also, which goes to the paper that I think we might discuss, is this collective process through which we create a collective identity and collective sense making, which is much more than prediction. So I would say, rather that we can't conclude from math results into that this other very complex, part of our lives. So I've always, even though this thing is called liquid democracy and there is the word democracy, I didn't call it liquid democracy, but I've always thought of my work in actually describing something different from what we call democracy. I think there are interesting parallels we can draw, but I'm really careful about not making unnecessary or unfounded leaps.
Maybe just before indeed we explore this paper you mentioned. So let's say we are at the end of your PhD. What are maybe the main conclusions you got, like, at the end of this kind of intellectual or academic journey? Were you intellectually different from when you started? What maybe are the shifts that happened within yourself?
You mean in terms of my research, or how I thought and how I felt and how I view the world?
Both, actually. Could be both.
Okay. On my research, I became really excited about this idea of second order knowledge. I think, and so to wrap on that side of the story, I first worked on these math models, and then I was eager to test in practice. So mathematically, what I did was identify conditions under which, if people behave in different kinds of way, then I had theoretical predictions for what would be the outcome at the level of collective intelligence. And then I ran a bunch of experiments to try to assess what was the probabilistic behavior that humans would exhibit. And there was a stark alignment in that the way in which people would make their delegation behavior was indicative of, with high probability, second order knowledge improving outcomes. Again, in this kind of predictive context where the questions I was asking were very concrete and had an actual solution, were things like sport prediction or knowledge tests for which there was an actual correct answer. So I definitely became even more, I started this inquiry without much of I didn't know whether it would work or not. I was ready to show that it was a terrible idea or it was a great idea. And I think I went away thinking that, yeah, using our networks and second order knowledge was great in general, and in most contexts could be probably helpful. At the personal level, my PhD advisor always used to say that you can't do two PhDs because the PhD is this journey through which you learn to learn, which might sound a bit redundant, or I don't know. Yeah, but I think I got what he meant towards the end of the PhD. I think I so enjoyed discovering different kinds and different ways in which humans had thought about, in my case, collective intelligence and collective decision making. I deep dived into the math theories, but I also worked with philosophers and political scientists, and it was just such a wonder to understand the different, cultures and ways of thinking, and the incredible knowledge that just humanity creates, and builds over the centuries. And I think that was something that I find just quite beautiful. I had the feeling during my PhD, I kept saying this for a while, that the ratio of things that I know over the things I don't know was dropping exponentially, because every day I was discovering there was all of these things to know, and the rate that was at which I was discovering what was to be known was very fast. Like it was doubling every day, but the rate at which I was learning things was quite constant because I have like, limited bandwidth. And that's scary because it feels that the world's constantly expanded and you're barely understanding a few things in the world. But I don't know, I felt I saw more clearly some things and I could organize in my mind more clearly some thoughts. And I thought that was worth it.
The fact that you explored political philosophy, does it change how you approached your own discipline?
I don't think it changes the way I approach my own discipline because, as I was saying earlier, I always thought my own discipline, should be used to talk about what it knew and not other things. And I just think that the object of study in political philosophy and in math is slightly different. So I've thought more of them as complementary ways of looking at the world rather than, in competition. I do think that there are questions that math answer that philosophy can't and vice versa.
Okay. I might share actually with you a quote, maybe to move forward. It's a quote from Alexis de Tocqueville that was, like as we're talking about democracy. So he's saying, I want to imagine under what new features despotism might appear in the world. I see an innumerable crowd of men alike and equal who endlessly revolve around themselves in pursuit of petty and vulgar pleasures with which they fill their souls. Each of them withdrawn into isolation is almost a stranger to the fate of all the others. His children and his few close friends constitute for him the whole of humankind. As for the rest of his fellow citizens, he is beside them but doesn't see them. He touches them but doesn't feel them. He exists only in himself and for himself. And if he still has a family, one can at least say that he has no longer a country. So this is this part where he's reflecting on the future of democracy and in a sense how a kind of unlimited desire of equality might counterbalance this desire we have of freedom, of liberty. And I would be interested in a sense to have your views on this quote. Do you believe we reached this level of kind of political indifference, let's say in Western countries? Or what are your views on this?
It's interesting. I remember some friends telling me that Tocqueville had so I think where I'm going with this is that there is a few of my colleagues and friends have been working on this idea of sortition and lotocracy. I don't know if you've heard the term, and they've often told me that Tocqueville was one of the person that was at the time where it might have happened was a key player in making it not happen. And I guess I didn't know that quote, but makes me think maybe I understand more what they were saying. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to think on top of my head and get maybe I'll thinking about this. I just want to expand in a few words about this idea of sortition and lotocracy, where if some of your audience doesn't know it, it's the idea of for some political decision you can sort out random people and have them decide. Is something that France has been using in some context in what is called citizen assemblies or les conventions citoyennes, where the people are gathered and listen to experts and talk to one another to think through creating this kind of, when I was saying before that in the democratic world, it's not as much about predicting the right outcome, but creating collective sense making. And I think these ideas are really interesting. I don't know exactly where Tocqueville is. I don't know. I can't say exactly where he, wrote his ideas or where I don't understand the full logic in what he says. So I'm going to have a hard time to, I think, comment more on it.
But indeed, I think it's completely connected to what you just mentioned, this idea that, and we will discuss it because this is really one of the fascinating, among many others, but one of the fascinating idea of your latest paper on AI reflectors, the fact that democracy is not only about guessing people's intentions, but giving them the space to explore them. And so like, do you feel that we lack personal engagement, political engagement nowadays, or not? Not really.
It's not a question on which I have deep expertise, so I don't want to, just give my opinion that is not founded in something that I would say has any scientific bearing. So I don't know.
Okay. So maybe now let's move into the heart of your latest paper, which is on AI reflector. So really fascinating paper. And so, well, maybe just before another quote I would like to share with you. This one you know it.
This one I know.
You know it. Beautiful quote. Can you explain what you think about it and why you started this paper with this quote?
Yeah, and I will read it because I do think it's lovely. So it's as you said, it's Dostoevsky, and indeed, well, if one day they really find the formula for all our wanting and caprices, that is what they depend on by precisely what law they occur, precisely how they spread, what they strive for, in such and such case, and so on and so forth. Well, a real mathematical formula, that is. Then perhaps man will immediately stop wanting. For who wants to want, according to a little table? So yeah, we opened the paper, and this is a paper I did while I was at Meta and across my time when at Meta and before at the Harvard Berkman Klein Center with my colleague Théophile Pénigaud, who's a political philosopher. And so I very serendipitously I found that quote. I was reading, I think it's a note from the underground, I think is the name of the book. And I stumbled upon this quote when we were starting talking about this project. And the genesis of the project was that I was studying this different kind of statistical framework to aggregate preferences and, kind of give, you can think of polls or voting or all of these different systems as ways of representing what people think in a way. And Théophile have been studying collective will and democracy from a philosophical perspective. And we kind of grouped around this idea of what exactly do we get about, what do we understand about the collective will when we do statistical modeling of it. And I think the math crowd and the philosophy crowd obviously comes from two very different angles, where it's a very, crude caricature, but maybe the math crowd can think that it actually represents what people want, while the philosophy crowd thinks that what people want is so undefined and messy and collectively created and understood that it's not something that really can resonate. And so what we set ourselves to do in this piece was to unpack what statisticians mean and do when they model collective preferences, and what this means from the philosophy standpoint. And I love this quote because in a sense it's living in a world where we mathematicalize and optimize everything, maybe there could be a danger of thinking that we can extract the juice completely out of what makes us human and completely automate what it means to want and think and have preferences. And so I love the last sentence here: who wants to want according to a little table? It's like, where's my free will? Where is my self-determination? If indeed what I think or what I want is captured or described or predicted based on a little table, which, in all of this collective preference work and stats, we have matrices that represent collective preferences, and that's pretty much a little table.
And so what is also fascinating in this paper is that actually you're not using AI to capture, or not only to capture, let's say, individual and collective preferences, but to go, let's say, deeper. But just before we explore this deeper, you explain in your paper that right now there is a use of AI agents to basically capture our intentionalities, in a sense, political intentionalities. Can you explain what does it mean and why you believe it's not enough as part of a democracy?
Yeah, okay. And maybe I can do a tiny kind of history little spiel before, because I do think that it's very interesting to think not only about where we are now, but also the historical arc that came before. And I think of this history starting with Gallup. So Dr. Gallup is an American statistician who in the 30s started using polls for presidential elections. And so he kind of introduced this idea of stratified sampling, which is when you make a poll in a country, you want to have a representative sample to have higher accuracy in the outcome of your polls. And so he kind of introduced stratified sampling, and he predicted the victory of FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, over Alf Landon in 1936. And there was this huge excitement around the fact that maybe math and stats would be able to capture and predict what people wanted. And so there is this whole kind of question around then what's the point of voting if like some stats or AI nowadays can fully capture it. And it inspired Isaac Asimov's novel called Franchise, where he envisioned that there was this machine. It's 1955, okay? Like it's pretty, he was ahead of his time as always, but and he had this idea of the multivac, which was this humongous machine that had ingested everything humanity ever produced, and that could decide on behalf of the citizenry who should lead the world, or the country. I guess it was at the level of a country. And the only thing that would happen is the machine would select a citizen every year, interview the citizen for 2 to 3 hours, and then based on this output, who would lead the country. And there was also an actual machine called, I think, the Univac, that was an American project that predicted the victory of Eisenhower in their early 50s, I think 1952, with a very small, the margin was very close to reality. So these ideas about the fact that we could make great predictions from some, fairly simple statistical analysis was kind of started from there. And there was lots of excitement about this. And there was also a few failures. Quite quickly after, between the two events I was mentioning, there was the Truman-Dewey election in 1948, where I think polls closed 3 weeks early because it was so clear that Truman would lose the election. Some newspapers even printed Dewey defeats Truman, because that was kind of the polls were so convinced that there was no way Truman could win. And you have a very famous image of Truman with a newspaper saying Dewey defeats Truman because he had just won the election. So that was I think the beginning of the really formal and also rigorous polls had existed before. I think Andrew Jackson might be the first election, which is the 7th president in the US, where you had polls. But an actual statistical framework and an actual methodology that ended up being replicated and used across ages. Gallup is the name of a polling institute in the US still. It's very influential, I think, introduction. So that was kind of, for me, the first time we had stats to try to model collective preferences. But in a way, when you think about polls, it's a very interesting, it's closed form. So you have a question and then you have options and you have to pick an option. But humans don't really think in this closed form fashion. We don't, when I make a decision, I'm not like checklist A, B, C, D, E, F, and then I'm going to pick one or the other. We think in natural language. And not if, when, and it's what we describe in the paper, the kind of second moment that I think was very, a phase transition in how we've modeled collective preferences was the introduction of, you can call it in different ways, but I'll call it the latent methods. What I mean by this, it's something that's greatly used in things like recommender systems. It's kind of all around the world, but I'd only focus on the people who've created a platform for this specific context of political or policy rather, crowdsourcing. And the platform that introduced this is Polis, which was created in 2008 by Colin McGill. And here the idea is that instead of voting on this question with option A, B, or C, you have people who write natural language. So they write an actual proposal, and then other humans vote on it. So the way in which people express their preference is still voting, but at least you have this natural language that was written, and people are actually reasoning about the natural language statement and not about just the pre-computed or predefined options. And then the thing that's really hard with natural language is aggregation. If I have a bunch of proposals that are explaining a bunch of things, how do you aggregate? So you have a bunch of proposals, you have a bunch of people, and people say, I like or I don't like a proposal. And that creates my little table. That's my matrix where I have people and proposals. And what these latent methods do is that they create a statistical representation of the people and of the proposal that can be recombined in the output vote that you see. So you can think kind of it as the matrix that you see is the product of two matrices. And these two matrices describe the people and describe the proposals. And what your algorithm does is that it learns this latent representation, which they are called latent because it's not something that is explicitly stated at any point in time. It's what you're inferring. But it happens so that this latent representation that you find, when you combine them together, is a really good way of giving you the output that you see when you look at the matrix of vote. So that was kind of the going from constrained options to being able to elicit free-form text, the way in which people think, and then gathering votes on them and being able to tell which proposals end up have which kind of properties. And with this, you can identify cluster of people who like similar things and do different kinds of analysis. So the key point with latent methods is really this idea of we went away from having pre-constrained polls to having people can write open statement. And as I said, it's similar to recommender system. On social media, it's what we have. We have a bunch of open-ended statement. It's like free-form text. And then the ranking happens based on the votes on these statements. So it's similar in concept and in idea. And it started being used at scale in both platforms I was mentioning, which are Polis and Remesh, which was created by Andrew Konya and also been quite influential in peacemaking processes around the world. Also, it's similar in flavor, although very different algorithm in what is happening in the community nodes algorithm, which, if in case you've heard of it, is on Twitter. If to do content moderation, since I think 2021, you have this method called community nodes, where if you see a post that you think is misleading, you can say, these need more context, and then people can write the extra context. And then the question is, how do we decide which of the nodes are appended to the actual Twitter post? And people go on and vote on the nodes. And you have it's a different methods there, but it's the same kind of idea of inferring people's preferences over free-form text to then aggregate and present an outcome in a way. So that was step 2. We went from polls to latent methods. And then the step 3 was to, there was kind of, that came with modern AI. So I guess lots of your audience has heard about large language models, LLMs. But if not, LLMs are these quite powerful AIs that you can talk to. So you can give it some text and then it outputs some text back to you. And in a sense, when I was telling you before that the question of how do we aggregate free-form text was a huge problem and we had to go through this latent method, AI gives you a kind of new solution and approach to this problem, because now I can give it free-form text and it can give me back free-form text. So, theoretically, I can just say, this is what everyone has said about this topic. What should we do? Now, of course, the issue with this is that you have, it's a black box, as people say. And we don't really always know or understand exactly why the model tells you something. And it might not be the highest legitimacy way of, making a decision by just saying, this person has written this and that person has written that. So what people have done, and in the paper we dwell specifically on 2 papers that I think are really interesting and introduced really a new way of thinking about this particular problem, which are the Habermas machine that was done by researchers at DeepMind, and generative social choice that was done by researchers at Harvard, where they've thought about a principled way of aggregating free-form text into an outcome using LLMs. Maybe I can pause here. And I forgot now if that answered your question. But
it did, in a sense. No, it did. That's super. Thanks actually for taking the time to make indeed this historical and scientific context. So to be sure, in a sense, to understand based on what you said, you wanted to create this discovery tool. I think you call it like this in your paper, with the aim of capturing language and behind this nuanced preferences, which is, from what I understand, actually a very tricky thing about aggregating and measuring those preferences. And what you're proposing is going a bit further than, let's say, common AI tools, because you don't only want to capture at a T moment what people want, which would be more or less possible, but let's say what they want, but you want to help them to politically self-explore, in a sense, who they are. Am I right?
Yeah, and I think that goes back to how we think about the use of the statistical methods I was mentioning in the real world, and the quote by Dostoevsky. Because what we're trying to argue against is the use of these kind of systems and statistical models to give you an outcome that's kind of the binding decision you have to go with. Like we're trying to argue against the franchise-like, which is this Asimov novel I was mentioning, setup. And we think it's super interesting, and it's a fascinating new tool that has huge potential. And we're trying to think through where we see the value of this potential. And kind of going back to the philosophy side, and also the quote from Dostoevsky, something that we dwell on in the paper is this idea that if these methods want to capture the collective will or collective preferences, they have to reckon with the fact that in most contexts, this is indeterminate. This is something that is co-created collectively. This is not something that's given like a Deus ex machina that just comes and can be revealed by some machine. And for so many reasons, because preferences change, because aggregation methods are imperfect, and also because it's this idea of self-determination is that we co-create this narrative. It's not something that's given to us. So if you take this as a postulate, and which we say is, you have this hypothesis versus the calculability hypothesis, which would be the idea that you can calculate anything and just represents preferences in a small table that's perfect representation. If you disagree with the calculability hypothesis and you go with the indeterminacy hypothesis, then how exactly do you use the systems, and how you think you should use them impacts how you design them. So this is where our proposal for an AI reflector comes in, where we're thinking that these tools can be super interesting as a self-discovery tool. And in a few seconds of political theory, that's kind of the whole idea of representation, which we often think in the context of a political representative, which is super important, is this kind of layer there is between collective preferences and actions. That's it's dynamic, it's future oriented. It's kind of, in a sense, representation functions as a mirror. It's through which the people continually reflect and reconsider their identity, their expectations, their conception of the common good. So that's kind of one thing. And then the other thing that we also leverage is this idea of the two track in democracy that Habermas formalized, the idea that you have he calls it a context of discovery and a context of justification. Context of discovery being the place where it's like the coffee shop or the bar where people just go and meet and mingle and discuss and exchange ideas. And then the context of justification, which is the formal institution that makes decision on our behalf, both being super important. And the way in which we think about this AI reflectors is to help create a representation in the context, a mirror rather, for the context of discovery. So in this space where we are trying to just, think about where we are at, try to better understand different perspectives, thinking about AI reflectors as a self-discovery tool in the context of discovery to help us better reflect on collective expectations and what we want. And in that sense, it's kind of the continuation of polls. It's just, new forms of polls, or maybe you can them at, and this is the two kind of things we say, you can have polls at much higher scale. Maybe you can have more participation. And because you can have more inputs into the systems, and you can write better summaries, synthesis of the preferences with AI systems. But the second piece, which I think is also really important and has often been overlooked, is the idea that you can have reflective elicitation. And what I mean by this is polls are typically, you have answer A, B, C, and then people say, yeah, I prefer option A, but that's a really non-reflective answer. Often, there are so many things that go in these answers, and also in the late 20th century, researchers at Stanford created this platform called deliberative polling, where the idea was to have a moment where people, before saying I think this or that, have a moment of deliberation, a moment of reflective moment where they put their perspective in the context of that of other, they step back, they take some perspective. They might think exactly the same as before, or they might change it slightly. And we see the potential of AI reflectors as not only being able to have scaled up synthesis, but also having reflective elicitation, which we think is really important for the collective sense making, for this making community, making society.
Yeah, because you have this beautiful image in your article. You make a difference between the portrait, so when you capture at a T moment like a political representation, and like the AI mirrors, the AI reflection. And in a sense, your assumption, which is beautiful but also an important one, is freedom. Like there is this possibility of self-discovery because people collectively can change and evolve. So that's why it would be also nonsense. Like this kind of capture, AI capture. Can you maybe describe these AI reflectors? Because like you have like two components in it. Can you explain concretely how what would it look like?
Sure. And so this idea of AI reflector is kind of a framework for how we think about how AI could be used coherently within public spheres. So the two stages are, as I said, this idea of reflective elicitation. So this concretely could be, you have a chatbot, and the chatbot asks you, there is a policy question. So there is something that you have to make a decision on, or not really sorry, let me take one step back and think in the context of a poll. So you have a poll, exactly the same one as you would find on Ipsos or any polling platform that you have. But now we're trying to get at, you have a poll, and then you have an article, and then you have a histogram, right? That's kind of how it looks like. Now the question is, how can you get a better representation of the collective preferences than just this question with 3 options in the histogram? So you can have the same question, but now you would have a moment before you enter the actual collective phase where you're just talking with your chatbot, and the chat you give your answer, and the chatbot or you can ask for facts, you can ask for information that you think would help you form an opinion if you don't have an opinion already formed, or you could ask what would be if you were to think that what would be an argument of someone who could disagree, or what would be the argument of someone who could agree. So you gather information that you think can help you make a more either informed or contextualized opinion about something. And to inject one more note, this is really rooted in the idea of a deliberation within, which is something that philosopher Gooden introduced, which is this idea of we deliberate when we talk to one another, but we also deliberate when we introspect, and we just think in our mind about putting our perspective in the context of that of other. So that's step 1. And then step 2 is you have this kind of opinion. How do you synthesize them? And so, as I said before, the kind of baseline, which is you take all of the opinions and the model outputs something. Another perspective could be that of the Habermas machine, where now you have different people who write actual statements. You have a machine that has been tuned on people's preferences, who writes a summary, and then the summary is sent back to the humans, and the humans can say how they feel about the summary, and then you can do this a few times. So you can have different ways, and this is an active area of research and open questions about how you do this synthesis, this kind of synthesis generation, with maybe some of the core components. You want that the outcome generated is inclusive of the collective judgment, and I think you would have many different ways of doing it. We also have a whole section about all that could go wrong with these kind of approaches. We know that LLMs have a bunch of limitations between, hallucinations, biases, and so that part is really an active area of research of how do you make that these systems are net positive. And I think we should try never to get caught into this. They have some problems, so we should not use them, because that's, I don't think that's the way in which we should think in general about innovation of technology. But of course, we have to make sure that we use it in a way that's distributively net positive. So but I think the summary is we care a lot about this reflective elicitation and synthesis generation. We have some ideas and proposals in the papers about what would be the kind of V0, the most basic way to implement it, and then inspiration by other people's work or open research questions we think could be explored to build better and more robust systems.
As I was reading your paper, I was wondering, because there is this, so you explicitly called on, explicitly talk about collective will, and on how you present like this discovery tool. We could have this idea of a kind of collective self-awareness. So, a kind of collective body that become maybe so mature that he has this kind of goal you proposing. And I was wondering, it's a maybe tricky question or complicated question, but do we know if historically some political body got this kind of collective self-awareness?
You mean with AI tools or in general, or?
In general, like by using other techniques or other means?
I mean, this is where I guess math and philosophy are different. That's a concept. I don't know if it's quantified in a way that anyone studied, empirically.
Okay.
That's where they are on the scale. It's a bit like, you were mentioning earlier, something we do talk a lot about, and it's very dear to my co-author, Théophile, is this idea that, the reason behind arguing against the calculability hypothesis or the multivac or this idea that you have a machine that decides for you is that that's kind of contrary to this self-determination ideal on which our societies were built. The idea that we are part of the making of society through elections now, and we have all of these different mechanisms that do matter a lot, and that disappears if you have like something that's kind of giving you an answer on which you don't have kind of control over, and then you have another entire line of work of also really interesting people working on how you can provide inputs to the AI systems. So you could imagine a world where you have an AI systems making binding decision, but you have ways of getting the public's input into the system, so that you have another kind of path to it. But I think I'm thinking of collective awareness, of self-determination, more as compasses rather than something that's actually quantified and you have a scale and you put everyone on that scale saying this is where you are. I don't think that exists.
Are you already testing this concept of AI reflectors? And I was also wondering while reading your paper, because, for example, with Urban AI, we're mainly working with cities, with like urban planners, and there is this like a goal really of around the community building this kind of self-awareness, let's say, on specific topic. And so, I was kind of practically wondering if you're already being tested this project.
I have not. My collaborator Théophile might have some things in the pipeline, and otherwise, always very happy to. I've connected with a bunch of folks who've thought and built things, and very happy to make connections there, or yeah.
Well, definitely, at least it definitely like raised some idea in the urban field. But good to know that maybe some incoming project in this topic. Maybe just some last questions I really wanted to explore with you. So I will try to select them. But so I listened one of your, I think it was a podcast, and you were saying that human nature doesn't change; it's human conditions that change. And I was wondering, like, in your opinion, what characterize current human conditions, and what are the implications politically?
Oh boy, I don't remember exactly the context in which I said that. That might have been an hypothesis I was formulating and building upon. Do you remember the context in more
Yeah,
detail?
so it was you were saying basically that so human conditions change and that you believe there is an oxidation. I remember this word, powerful word, oxidation of some human conditions, which is why you believe there are no universal good political systems, but that it might change depending on specific context or specific human conditions. So that's what, yeah.
I see. Yeah, I think I might also have been referring to, at least that's reminiscent of Bruce Schneier has this book, I think, called The Hacker Mind, which is about how when you have any kind of system in place, humans will try to find ways around. And I think also I was also reflecting on this specifically in the context of liquid democracy, where when I was working on it, I think there's a community excited about it as a system, and I think there are very interesting things about the system. But I always resisted the idea that there is any perfect system, and same with sortition or lotocracy. I think all of these systems are really interesting, but also have failure modes. And I've always been really resistant of whether it's for any kind of system, that sometimes when people have the feeling that things are not working as they want to work, they say, well, this is the perfect system and we know it. And people say this with sortition and ranked choice voting and liquid democracy and all of that. And I don't give into this narrative because I think this is wishful thinking. I think we don't realize that things don't work out for a million reasons, and that we would be disappointed if we were to think that changing this with that would solve all of the problems we think do exist. So in that context, I do think that it's such a complex and integrated system that we should just I think collective decision making is and will remain a massive business. We won't code our way out of it. We won't AI govern our way out of it. And I think it's complex, and there's a beauty in its complexity, and we should think much more about how I think this optimization mindset that maybe sometimes we inherit collectively might make us not realize that there are some problems that are not to be optimized, really. They're to be co-constructed, and I'd love to learn more also about the work at Urban AI. I've also often thought that for things like urban planning, it's also quite interesting because I'm sure in many contexts you don't have one perfect solution. You have a bunch of stakeholders and you have a complex ecosystem to navigate, and that I guess that we would know if now there was the perfect process through which you run through an urban planning problem, and that's not the point. The point is different. I don't know if I can exactly capture what is the point, but I think that's the context probably in which I was thinking about this oxidation, and not go too down the path of thinking whatever you do is the silver bullet that will solve all of the problems that everyone think or believe exist.
Yeah, a lot of similarities indeed with urban fields in general, and more specifically on urban AI, like this idea of complexity and how we build kind of community awareness. By the way, we will have another urban AI conversation specifically on this topic. I think it's on early December. So if you're looking, save the date, and it will be with Japanese practitioner specialized in community design and exploring how using generative AI for this. Last question I wanted also to ask, so maybe two things. The first one is that in your paper you explain, and very interestingly, that we could tell that it might remove face-to-face interactions, but you explain that actually the goal is not to create a kind of political closed systems, but it's more a tool supporting other deliberation. And I thought it was really great perspective. And you have another remark where you're connecting it with Rousseau's dream of harmonious collective deliberation. The quote is where every citizen states only his own opinion. And so is it a kind of ideal democracy, this democracy where you don't have those power relations you described, which I agree might marginalize some population, but they're also part of this frictionality, or like maybe the bad, not bad, but some consequences of face-to-face deliberation, no?
I think if I understood your question correctly, what we're trying to say is that we don't think any of what we're suggesting should replace any existing infrastructures. I think we think of it as complementary tools to one another, both to face-to-face deliberation, and you have pros and cons to face-to-face deliberation. There is a big literature on this, and people do online deliberations, people do anonymous deliberations, you have a whole bunch of different ways of thinking about this. You have people who are only proponents of in-person. So, I do think that all of these things are complementary, also complementary with, lots of other infrastructure. I'm a big fan, for instance, of a piece of work called the Federalist Papers, where the American founding fathers laid down the reasoning behind current institutions, which I think is super important, and that this how the republic was built. And of course, I think all of these things should be articulated together. And back to the point before of there is no such thing as ideal democracy. There is no such thing as the perfect systems that bulletproof. So I think Ada Palmer is a very inspiring historian at U Chicago, who talks about having different kinds of systems spread out in different, like deliberation and elections and representative and this and this and that, because it's much harder to, like hack a bunch of different things than it is to have the one same system that's like kind of replicated a million times. So I think of AI Reflector as complementary to many things that already exist and that should be integrated, definitely not replace. Specifically, I think if I understood your question well, should not replace in-person deliberation, but can be used in context where you can't, because you can't have 1 million people in an in-person room and everyone talk to one another. So think about different contexts where maybe AI Reflector have benefits that deliberations do not have.
Okay, very clear. So yeah, that's a tool, a discovery tool supporting other mechanisms and deliberation. Well, thanks a lot, really, Manon, for taking the time to discuss your latest research and more broadly, actually, some of your works at the intersection of liquid democracy, AI reflectors, and collective preferences. Already the end of this urban AI conversation. We will meet again next week. It will be 1 hour earlier with the city of Portland to explore how they've been using generative AI to simplify permitting. Thanks a lot, and thanks again, Manon.
Thanks for having me. Bye.